Hey everybody, John here, and I'd like to deliver a brief talk on the relationship between professional identity, credentials, and ethics. I'm going to really try and get straight to the point here. Uh, and that starts with the basic idea of what is a profession? Well, a profession is basically a job that has been attributed a special designation and granted a sanction to provide a specialized service to the broader community. So basically, a job that the community has decided should be provided by a certain group of people. Uh, and in that context, a profession is recognized by the community as being especially prepared or sufficiently and uniquely qualified to provide that service. Therefore, it's in the community's best interest for the profession, for the skill provided by the profession or the service provided by the profession to be provided exclusively by members of that profession, right? So, doctors, medical doctors, physicians, for example, are licensed. They require a license to practice because the broader community has decided that for someone to practice medicine, they need to be licensed as a physician. The broader community has decided that only doctors should provide medical services. Professionalization, excuse me, is the process by which members of a profession establish themselves as the providers of that discrete, specific, specialized service. So it's the developmental process of the members of a profession establishing themselves as the unique providers of a given service. Professionalization involves the identification of specialized skills, so figuring out what specialized skills and training are required. It involves the establishment of professional organizations and associations. So I probably shared with you all at some point that our program, the counseling program here at WVU, we are undergoing a change in our credentialing such that we are going to be duly accredited by the Council on Rehabilitation Education, so our rehabilitation credentials, and then by the KCREP, by the broader accrediting body for counselors. And it is an onerous process. It is a very challenging process. And so part of the professionalization of counseling and rehabilitation counseling was the establishment of those organizations and accrediting bodies that now determine whether or not our program and other programs can legitimately claim to be training, to be being to if we can claim to be providing training that is in line with the standards established by those organizations. Pardon me, sorry that took me a minute to get out there. So again, the process involves acquiring the sanction from the broader community to be the exclusive provider of the service. And that sanction, so kind of the okay from the broader community, is the credentials held by the practitioner. So that could be in the broader field of counseling for mental health counselors, the credential of licensed professional counselor is the primary credential identifying counselors as the sole practitioners of counseling services. Within rehabilitation counseling, the credential has traditionally been the CRC, or the Certified Rehabilitation Counselor credential. And those credentials, acquiring those credentials, hinges on completing training at an accredited program. So what we're looking at is we're looking at how professions get to be established as professions, what the steps are, and then what the actual markers and sanctions are that indicate members of the profession. So some characteristics of professions. Professions are, again, occupations that are recognized as professions, as being the group that should provide a designated service. They involve a developmental course of emergence. So what that means basically for counseling is that as a field, counseling is a better, stronger field today than it was 30 years ago. We'd say the same about medicine. Medicine today is a stronger field than it was at the beginning of the 1900s, for example. There's a developmental course of emergence, a refinement in terms of skills and techniques, ethical standards, all that stuff. It's always, it's an ongoing developmental course of emergence. Professions reflect characteristics of its members. So for counselors, that means that as counselors, you contribute to the field. We all contribute to the field. It's the profession of counseling is a reflection of the individuals who provide the service. And therefore, maybe not and therefore, but related to that, professions are granted significant autonomy by the broader community. So frequently there will be a credential such as licensure that is it's a legally established credential, right? So that's an external credential provided by a external body. However, the standards that licensure reflects are generally created by members of the profession, right? So what that's basically saying is that, well, who decides what are the key characteristics of a physician or of a counselor in their physician's training and a counselor's training? Well, physicians decide for physicians for the most part, and counselors decide for counselors for the most part. So again, that's part of that picture of the broader community, the society has recognized, hey, you know what? Those guys are the experts. Those folks are the experts. Let's get them to establish the meaning of an appropriately trained and credentialed practitioner. Apparently that's so important I wanted to say it twice. Here's the second slide with the same words. It's actually prepping me to take a closer look at a developmental course of emergence. So let's go on here to the next slide. You have professional associations. So that's a within profession development. So say National Council on Rehabilitation Education is a council that is formed by the profession, and that's kind of a meeting where rehabilitation educators meet together within the profession to develop the profession, to strengthen the profession. Then you kind of go to the next level, kind of outward a little bit, to program accreditation. Now, program accreditation is an auditing process where our program is audited by an external body who looks at our curriculum and makes sure that we're hitting all of the right notes. This is preparing us for our role in the community. So you go back to the professional associations like NCRE, for example, and you've got members of the profession working together to make the profession stronger. Then you go to program accreditation, and you've got the external body looking at credentialing processes and ensuring that they meet the needs of the profession. And then you go to the third step, and we'll use licensure here because it's easier to talk about than certification. Licensure is a institution that has legal status. So here it's the community, the society, taking a look at the profession and saying, okay, they've done sufficient within profession development, they've done sufficient preparation for their community role, such that we want to establish this group of people as the only people who can provide this service. So the formation, structure, and functions of professional associations primarily reflects the within profession development. And what that is the group of professionals really building up, authoring their shared professional identity. It's the very kind of internal process. Then as you move to accreditation activities are conducted by members of the associated profession and include consultation with individuals from the broader community who have a stake in the profession's success. So accreditation is kind of headed up by members of the profession, but in collaboration with members of the broader community, so that the broader community has some input in terms of what the broader community needs from the profession. And the members of the broader community that can participate in the accreditation process can be consumers, potential employers, and other stakeholders who help to devise and establish training standards. And then finally, licensure is recognition by the broader community that the profession has completed those previous two steps and is therefore uniquely qualified to provide the service. So at that point, at the point of licensure is established, you have the broader community saying, we only want counselors providing counseling. And if you don't have a license as a counselor, we don't want you practicing counseling. Now, as I indicated, licensure is a legal institution, and it's bound up with scope of practice legislation. So, scope of practice legislation are laws that dictate some aspects of practice, right? So, scope of practice legislation, for example, establishes standards related to privacy and confidentiality in our field, informed consent, mandatory reporting, and reasonable standards of care. Scope of practice legislation also requires that under reasonable standards of care, practitioners have sound theoretical knowledge of the people that they're serving, and the ability to provide reliable services. So you can see where all of these different tentacles, if you will, come back to provide the framework for the training that we're completing now. Again, under scope of practice legislation and reasonable standard of care, the focus is on ensuring the safety of clients, patients, and the broader community. It's establishing standards of documentation and broad ethics. And any individual who provides a service that falls within the legal scope of a given profession, as established by scope of practice, any clinician who provides such a service is required to be appropriately credentialed as a member of the profession. So scope of practice legislation establishes just what the profession looks like and says that anyone who provides a service that looks like this needs to be properly trained, right? That's why I couldn't open a medical practice tomorrow and start saying I'm a physician without ever having any physician training. So I mentioned earlier that professions are occupations that are recognized as professions. They involve a developmental course of emergence. They reflect characteristics of their members, and they're granted significant autonomy by the broader community. In terms of reflecting characteristics of the membership of a profession, that means is that professional identity is transmitted back and forth. That's what dialectically means, fancy word for back and forth. That professional identity is transmitted back and forth between the profession and its members. So for example, half of my job at WVU is research. So that means that what I need to do is I need to develop original research and share it with the field through our journals and publications. And then at the same time, I need to consume the research. I need to read the research of other members of the profession. So there's that back and forth component. There's also an orientation towards altruistic service rooted in professional skills. So what that means is, as a group, as a profession, all of us, we don't make decisions based solely on our self-interest. And in that way, we're different from folks who might fundamentally identify it as business people. Not to say that business people aren't ethical, but we have a responsibility to carry out our professional roles in such a way that the interest of our consumers is our primary focus. That's that altruistic part. Like Coca-Cola, for example. Nothing wrong with Coca-Cola. I love Coca-Cola. But it's not the CEO's job, CEO of the Coca-Cola company, it's not his or her job every night to think about how can I serve the interest of my customers best. Their job is to sell Coca-Cola. That's not our job. I mean, obviously we have to make a living, but it has to be rooted in altruistic service, in professional skills. We need to be committed to advancing the discipline. And one of the ways that happens, last bullet is a little less formal, but an among member collegiality. So the sharing of information, working together to better the field, as opposed to kind of a competitive approach to carving out unique territory that no one else can touch. Does that make sense? And then finally, this is the same slide that I keep coming back to with the developmental course of emergence, reflecting characteristics of the members, and then granted significant autonomy by the broader community. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means that professions are largely self-regulating. So there is licensure, which is legally binding and has teeth in the broader community. However, the processes that create licensure and contribute to licensure are really generated largely by members of the profession. So our credentialing, our licensing bodies, our oversight bodies, our disciplinary apparatuses. So, when we talk about CRC CRCC code violations. We talked about this a little bit early in the semester, and how there's a record kept of violations, and the CRCC can take disciplinary action. That's the field regulating itself. That's a reflection of self-regulation and of the autonomy granted the field by the broader community. And then ethics are central to our professional identity, to our process of accreditation and credentialing, in that they help us identify right and wrong actions. They help us decide what is the clinically correct thing to do. Without these abilities, then we would lose the sanction provided by the community to provide our service. So without ethics, we literally would not have a profession. That's all I have for us on this topic. I hope you all have a great week. Thank you for listening.